It always begins with silence. Not an explosion, not a crash, not the thunder of markets breaking, but a quiet distortion, like the air tightening before a storm. People go about their days believing the world beneath their feet is solid, immutable, backed by numbers and institutions they never question. And then one morning, everything they trusted begins to evaporate. The collapse never looks obvious at first. It's a subtle flicker on a stock ticker, a sudden freeze in credit lines, a headline about temporary instability. But beneath those surface tremors lies something far older, far more deliberate. A system built on the illusion of stability, engineered to fracture precisely when the architects decide it must. Picture a family waking up to find their savings locked behind a digital wall. System maintenance, the bank says. Picture traders staring at screens where prices fall faster than they can react, as if gravity itself had been rewired. Picture governments all wrapped in benevolence, yet each one tightening the grip of the same entities that oversaw the system's fragility in the first place. When a nation's currency buckles, it is not the printing presses or the markets that fail. It is trust. And trust, once broken, becomes the perfect tool for those who understand how to manufacture dependence. A population stripped of financial security becomes pliable, compliant. They cling to any institution that promises safety, unaware that the cost of rescue is sovereignty. History books portray financial disasters as accidental, the result of speculation, mismanagement, unlucky timing. But the deeper you look, the clearer the pattern becomes. Crises do not simply happen. They emerge at the intersection of leverage, secrecy, and centralized authority. Each collapse is an opportunity, a recalibration that shifts the balance further toward those who operate in the shadows of monetary power. And yet, in every crisis, there is a moment, brief but revealing, when the public glimpses the architecture behind the curtain. When central banks slash rates overnight, when trillions appear from thin air, when institutions deemed too big to fail are rescued instantly, while ordinary people drown slowly. These moments expose a truth the system tries desperately to bury. Money is not a neutral tool. It is a weapon, and someone is always holding it. The doom you see on the surface, the falling markets, the frozen banks, the desperate crowds, is only the beginning. The deeper doom is the realization that the collapse was never the problem. It was the trigger. The opening act of a ritual that has repeated across centuries, always with the same outcome. The consolidation of power in the hands of those who operate above governments, above nations, above the visible world. But the real question, the one almost no one asks, is this. If collapses are predictable, who ensures they keep happening? Long before modern economies, before digital markets and central bank press conferences, the world ran on a simpler truth. Whoever controlled the money controlled the empire. This truth did not emerge overnight. It formed through centuries of repetition, failure, reinvention, and quiet domination. And when you trace the arc of financial history, a chilling realization forms. Every era believed it was immune to the mistakes of the past, and every era was wrong. The pattern begins in ancient kingdoms, where rulers discovered that wealth could be conjured not through conquest, but through manipulation. A king would shave silver from coins, diluting their purity, stretching the same metal further while the public remained unaware. Prices rose, wages stagnated, tension built. And as the people spiraled into uncertainty, the ruler consolidated more power under the guise of managing the crisis he himself created. Centuries later, medieval lenders refined the pattern. They learned that lending money to kings during wartime granted influence far beyond wealth. Debt became a leash, invisible, unbreakable. Monarchs served at the pleasure of those who financed their survival, and entire nations found themselves trapped in a cycle of borrowing and submission. The lender did not need a throne to rule. Debt was the throne. Then came the birth of the first central banks. They appeared as stabilizing forces, institutions built to safeguard nations from financial ruin. But beneath the noble language lay a familiar architecture: control through scarcity. These banks regulated the flow of money, tightening and loosening it like a noose around the economy's neck. When liquidity flooded, people thrived. When liquidity dried, industries collapsed, land changed hands, and power quietly migrated to the institutions capable of creating or denying currency. With every century, the pattern sharpened. Expansion, inflation, crisis, consolidation. 4 movements in a symphony that has played across civilizations. The Dutch experienced it. The British Empire mastered it. The United States inherited it. Each believed they had discovered a new financial frontier, yet each repeated the same cycle, only now with more sophisticated tools, more complex mechanisms, and a public even further removed from understanding how money truly works. The pattern thrives on opacity. The ordinary person sees inflation as a natural occurrence, interest rates as technical adjustments, recessions as unfortunate economic weather. But history tells a different story. These events are levers, manipulated at key moments to shift wealth upward and surrender national autonomy to entities that never face elections, never face consequences, and never relinquish control. Look closely, and you see the rhythm everywhere. Periods of easy credit encourage spending and risk-taking. The bubble grows. Then, a tightening. Interest rates rise, liquidity vanishes, markets collapse. In the aftermath, assets are cheap, debt is abundant, and those with access to newly printed money, always the same institutions, acquire real wealth for pennies on the dollar. The public loses, the architects gain, and the cycle resets, polished, rebranded, yet unchanged. Even the language remains consistent across eras. What ancient rulers called debasement, modern bankers call quantitative easing. What medieval lenders described as sovereign obligation, economists now frame as necessary fiscal policy. The actors may change, but the script does not. Why? Because this pattern is not a flaw of the system. It is the system. When you recognize this, something unsettling happens. History stops feeling distant. It becomes a mirror, a loop. Every economic collapse you learned about in school, the Panic of 1907, the Great Depression, the stagflation of the 1970s, the 2008 financial crisis, follows the same choreography perfected centuries before. Expand, inflate, collapse, consolidate. And always, behind the scenes, a central authority emerges stronger, more essential, more embedded in the lifeblood of the nation. The pattern does not merely repeat, it tightens, because with every cycle, the public becomes more dependent, the institutions become more powerful, and the space for escape narrows. This is the part where the past stops being historical and becomes prophetic. If the same mechanisms shaped ancient kingdoms, medieval empires, and modern nations, then what exactly is shaping us now? History doesn't repeat itself in obvious ways. It echoes, quietly, precisely, like the same hand striking the same concealed chord across centuries. And today, those echoes have never been louder. Because the techniques used by ancient empires to control their populations are not artifacts of the past. They are blueprints. And modern central banks have perfected them with mathematical elegance and digital precision. Consider Rome, slowly hollowing out its own currency. Silver coins once carried real weight, real value. But as the empire stretched and debts grew, the rulers shaved the coins thinner, mixing precious metal with cheaper alloys. The citizens didn't notice at first. Prices crept up, savings eroded. The empire tightened its grip. The mechanism was simple: dilute the currency, concentrate the power. Now look at today's quantitative easing. No coins to shave, no metal to debase, only numbers on a balance sheet, conjured with the push of a button. Trillions of dollars materialize out of nothing, expanding the money supply far faster than the public can comprehend. The effect is identical. Purchasing power evaporates silently, while assets, real assets, become the domain of those closest to the source of freshly created money. A modern debasement, hidden beneath academic language and press conference smiles. Or take the medieval debt traps that bound entire kingdoms to private lenders. Wars were financed with loans that kings could never fully repay, creating a dependency that shaped policy, alliances, even succession. Today, nations drown in sovereign debt, issuing bonds in perpetuity, paying interest not to ancient lenders, but to institutions that operate beyond borders, beyond elections, beyond democratic scrutiny. The chain is no longer iron. It is digital, elastic, omnipresent. Yet it holds just as tightly. And then there is controlled scarcity. Ancient rulers hoarded grain to stabilize their power. When famine loomed, they released just enough to appear as saviors, while ensuring continued dependence. Today, central banks manage liquidity the same way, opening the taps in good times, choking them during downturns. When money is abundant, risk feels harmless. When money dries up, even giants fall. And in the desperation that follows, entire sectors become vulnerable to acquisition, consolidation, and absorption by those who hold the keys to liquidity. These parallels are not coincidences. They are continuations. Modern systems have simply evolved beyond the need for physical manipulation. The printing press replaced the mint. The algorithm replaced the printing press. Digital ledgers replaced the vault. Control became cleaner, quieter, more abstract, but infinitely more powerful. What once required armies, decrees, and visible force can now be achieved with minor adjustments to interest rates and balance sheets. And yet the public believes this era is different. They trust that central banks act as neutral guardians, protectors of stability. But stability for whom? Recessions, inflation waves, asset bubbles, currency devaluation. These are framed as unfortunate side effects of a complex world. But the parallels tell a different story. These mechanisms are tools, predictable, repeatable, devastating, and profitable for those who sit closest to the spigot of money creation. Every empire used the same cycle: expansion, fed by easy money, followed by collapse, engineered through scarcity. Every empire discovered that fear is easier to rule than prosperity, and every empire believed it could stretch the system forever. But the most unsettling parallel is this: ancient societies felt the decline long before they recognized the cause. By the time they finally understood who controlled their fate, it was already too late. Today, we stand in the same position, confident, distracted, and unaware that the mechanisms shaping our economy are not modern at all. They are ancient, refined, digitized, invisible, and they are tightening around us. Every crisis has a signature: a sudden tightening of credit, a cascade of failing institutions, a headline announcing an emergency intervention. But behind the spectacle, behind the panic and the televised assurances, lies a truth almost too large, too orchestrated, too meticulously hidden to believe. The modern world is governed not by presidents or parliaments, but by an unelected network of monetary architects. For decades, central banks have been portrayed as guardians of prosperity, neutral, scientific, immune to politics. But neutrality is the greatest illusion of all. Because when you examine how decisions are made, who benefits, and how power concentrates after every crisis, the facade collapses. These institutions do not simply manage the economy. They shape it. They select winners and losers. They decide which banks live, which corporations fall, which governments receive lifelines and which are left to drown. And the most terrifying part? They do it quietly, behind closed doors, in rooms the public never sees. Policy is sculpted by a constellation of central banks that move as one organism. Their meetings are private. Their minutes are sanitized. Their decisions move trillions, rewrite national destinies, and reorder global hierarchies, all without a single democratic vote. This hidden order is not theoretical. Its power reveals itself every time a crisis erupts. When markets freeze, central banks step in, not as neutral firefighters, but as architects of the rebuild. They buy failing assets, inject liquidity into chosen institutions, and expand their balance sheets to astronomical levels. Each intervention creates a deeper dependency, each rescue binding governments more tightly to the very institutions they claim to oversee. Consider how swiftly they act when the powerful are threatened. In a matter of hours, emergency funds materialize. Insolvent giants are revived. Entire markets are propped up by money pulled from a dimension the public cannot access. But when ordinary people suffer, layoffs, lost homes, collapsing pensions, the response is slow, bureaucratic, tangled in protocols. The message is unmistakable. The system does not exist to protect you. It exists to preserve itself. Across continents, these central banks communicate with a precision bordering on orchestration. Interest rates rise in unison. Liquidity tightens at the same moment. Balance sheets expand in parallel. There is no need for conspiracy when the structure itself ensures alignment. Their power is not derived from secrecy alone. It is embedded into the architecture of global finance, a web of influence connecting Washington, Frankfurt, London, Tokyo, Basel. A silent empire without borders, without elections, without accountability. And governments? They appear powerful, but they borrow their power, literally. Nations run on debt. Debt priced, controlled, and ultimately dictated by the same institutions that claim to be tools of the state. If a government refuses to comply, bond markets punish it. Credit dries up. Its currency is attacked. A financial noose tightens until submission becomes unavoidable. The throne is decorative. The real authority resides in the ability to create or withhold money. Even wars, sanctions, and geopolitical tensions bend around this invisible architecture. A nation with central bank support can wage conflicts indefinitely. A nation cut off from global liquidity collapses without a shot fired. Monetary power does not simply influence geopolitics, it scripts it. And still, the public believes central banks are merely reacting to crises, not shaping them. That inflation is accidental, that bubbles form naturally, that debt spirals because of mismanagement. The truth is far darker. These events expand the empire. Every collapse creates another justification for intervention. Every intervention increases dependence. Every dependence strengthens the hand that controls the flow of money. In the shadows, the monetary architects grow bolder. They no longer hide the scale of their influence. Trillions appear overnight. Global coordination is announced proudly. Digital currencies are proposed, not as innovations, but as instruments of total control. For the first time in history, the architects are no longer bound by physical constraints. They can create infinite money. They can track every transaction. They can freeze accounts without warning. And they can do it all with the authority of institutions the public still believes are guardians rather than rulers. This is the revelation. The empire controlling the modern world has no flag, no army, no anthem. It has balance sheets. And the deeper you look, the clearer the truth becomes. They are not managing the system. They are the system. Every system built on illusion eventually reaches a point where the illusion becomes too heavy to sustain. The numbers grow too large. The promises grow too thin. The debt curves upward like a breaking wave, and the machinery of control begins to strain under its own weight. And somewhere beneath the noise of headlines and forecasts, a truth quietly emerges. We are approaching the end of a cycle that has repeated for centuries, but never on a scale like this. The modern financial order rests on foundations that no longer resemble stability. Currencies stretch beyond their limits, inflated by decades of temporary measures. Nations owe more than they can ever repay. Central banks expand balance sheets into the realm of the surreal, creating oceans of liquidity that flood markets, warp incentives, and push entire economies into a dependence so complete it becomes indistinguishable from captivity. This trajectory doesn't continue forever. It can't. Systems built on ever-growing debt require ever-growing trust, and trust is the one resource the architects cannot print. So the reset becomes inevitable. Not announced, not voted on, but unfolding through a quiet sequence of events that look, at first, like coincidence. Rising inflation, tightening credit, geopolitical fractures, supply shocks, synchronized downturns. Each event nudges the world closer to a point where the old monetary order can no longer sustain the weight of its own contradictions. History teaches us that when empires reach this stage, they search for reinvention. Rome reminted its coins. Medieval kingdoms rewrote debts. The great powers of the 20th century abandoned gold. And now, the modern world prepares for its own transformation, not through silver or paper, but through code. A new monetary architecture, digital and centralized, promising efficiency while quietly erasing the last fragments of financial autonomy. The blueprint is already visible. Digital IDs tied to digital currencies, real-time monitoring of transactions, programmable money, centralized permission to spend, save, or exist within the financial grid. To many, this will be sold as progress, a solution to crisis, a path towards stability. But the trade-off is monumental. The surrender of the last space where individuals could act outside institutional control. Yet, inevitability is not the same as helplessness, because every reset also reveals the limits of the system it replaces. When a structure becomes too powerful, too invasive, too dependent on secrecy, it eventually exposes itself. And exposure is the beginning of resistance. People start asking questions they were never meant to ask. They begin seeking alternatives: sound money, decentralized systems, local resilience, ways of storing value beyond the reach of institutions that do not answer to them. This is the narrow path out. Not rebellion in the streets, but awareness in the mind. The ability to see the architecture of control before it fully solidifies. To understand the historical rhythm and refuse to be swept into its undertow. To recognize that empires fall not because they are challenged, but because they become so overconfident in their dominance that they forget their power depends on consent, disguised as inevitability. Central banks can control liquidity. They can dictate interest rates. They can move markets with a sentence, but they cannot control what people understand once the veil is lifted. They cannot contain the spread of awareness when a population begins to recognize the system as it truly is. A beautifully engineered trap whose power dissolves the moment people see the bars. The reset is coming. The architecture is already shifting. The blueprint for the next era is unfolding in plain sight. But unlike past civilizations, we are not blind. We have the benefit of history, the clarity of patterns, and the ability to decode the mechanisms before they close around us. And that is where hope lives. Not in the collapse of the system, but in the awakening it forces. Because once you understand who holds the power, you also understand something even more important. They only rule as long as we believe they must.